When the Roosevelt political dynasty and the DuPont industrial empire merged, America expected a legend. But this story does not take place on the political stage of Washington or in the tense boardrooms of Delaware. It unfolds behind gilded doors in the isolation of sprawling estates where the expectations of two great families became an invisible prison. This is the story of a woman entirely apart, one born to an industrial empire but married into a political dynasty, a woman who inherited boundless wealth yet craved simple peace, and was ultimately destroyed by the prestigious name she carried. This is the forgotten story of Ethel DuPont. Her life is proof that having all the money and power is not a fairy tale. For Ethel, it was a burden. Trapped between the two greatest names in America, she lived a life that was never truly her own. To understand the story of Ethel DuPont and Franklin Roosevelt Jr., you have to understand the world they were born into. America in the early 20th century was a land of staggering contrasts. On one hand, there was the Great Depression, an economic cataclysm that brought millions of ordinary people to their knees, a time of breadlines, dust bowls, and desperate uncertainty. On the other, there was a rarefied stratosphere of wealth and power occupied by families whose fortunes were almost beyond comprehension. The Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and, perhaps most formidably, the DuPonts. The DuPont family was not just rich, they were an institution. Their story began in the aftermath of the French Revolution, when Eleuthère Irénée Dupont, a student of the famed chemist Antoine Lavoisier, fled to America and established a gunpowder mill on the banks of the Brandywine Creek in Delaware. Over the next century and a half, the E. Dupont de Nemours and company grew into a chemical behemoth, its innovations touching everything from dynamite and synthetic fibers, like nylon, to paints and plastics. Their wealth wasn't just old money, it was foundational money, deeply embedded in the industrial rise of the United States. To be a DuPont was to be born into a world of immense privilege, but also one of profound insularity and expectation. The family was a tight-knit, almost clannish dynasty centered in Delaware. They lived on sprawling estates with names like Winterthur, Longwood, and Nemours, magnificent compounds of stone and glass set amidst meticulously manicured gardens, shielded from the eyes of the common man. They had their own customs, their own social circles, and a deeply ingrained sense of their own importance. The DuPonts were notoriously private and in many cases staunchly Republican, their conservative pro-business principles often putting them at odds with the progressive political winds of the era. They believed in industry, in self-reliance, and in the quiet, dignified exercise of power. It was into this world on June 7, 1916, that Ethel DuPont was born. She was the eldest child of Eugene DuPont Jr., a direct descendant of the company's founder. Her home was Owl's Nest, a grand 25-room mansion in Greenville, Delaware, a place of quiet luxury and ordered routine. From her earliest days, Ethel was steeped in the DuPont ethos. She was educated by governesses, attended the exclusive Mrs. Hebb's school, and spent her time engaged in the pursuits deemed appropriate for a young lady of her station: horseback riding, social gatherings, and preparing for a suitable marriage that would ideally link her to another family of similar standing. By all accounts, Ethel was a product of her environment, but also something of an outlier within it. She was described as exquisitely beautiful, but also intensely shy, sensitive, and reserved. While some of her cousins and peers might have been more flamboyant or assertive, Ethel possessed a gentle, retiring nature. She loved animals, particularly her horses, and found solace in the quiet countryside of her family's estate. She was not a woman who sought the spotlight. She was a woman for whom the spotlight was an inescapable fact of her birth. Her life was preordained. She was a DuPont heiress. And with that title came a weight of expectation that would prove to be both a golden ticket and a leaden burden. On the other side of the American aristocracy was a family whose power was not measured in chemical patents or stock portfolios, but in political capital and public adoration. The Roosevelts. If the DuPont were industrial royalty, the Roosevelts were America's political kings. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, was a figure of immense charm and authority, guiding the country through the twin crises of the Depression and the looming threat of a Second World War. His family was the epitome of the Eastern establishment, patrician, well-educated, and fiercely dedicated to public service. The Roosevelt children grew up in a world that was the polar opposite of the DuPont's cloistered Delaware enclave. Their lives were a whirlwind of public appearances, political rallies, and constant media attention. The White House was not just a home, it was a stage. Their father was not just a parent, he was the most powerful man in the world. And among his children, none seemed to embody the Roosevelt swagger and charisma more than his third child and second son, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. Born in 1914, Frank, or Brood, as his family called him, was movie star handsome, standing 6'4", with a booming laugh and an infectious, sometimes overwhelming energy. He was gregarious, confident, and possessed the easy charm of a man who had never known a door to be closed to him. He attended Groton and Harvard, prestigious institutions that were practically a birthright for a Roosevelt, but his real education was in the art of being a Roosevelt. He knew how to work a room, how to command attention, and how to live life on a grand, unapologetic scale. He was accustomed to the public gaze and thrived in it. He was a man built for the spotlight Ethel so naturally shunned. The collision of these two worlds, the quiet heiress from the private world of Delaware industry and the boisterous son from the public stage of American politics, began in the mid-1930s. Franklin Jr. was a law student at the University of Virginia, and Ethel was making her society debut. They were introduced, as so many of their class were, at a series of debutante balls and high society parties. The attraction was immediate and undeniable. To the shy, sheltered Ethel, Franklin Jr. must have seemed like a force of nature. He was exciting, worldly, and radiated a confidence that was both alluring and perhaps a little intimidating. He was the son of the president, a young man with a famous name and a future that seemed limitless. For Franklin Jr., Ethel was the ultimate prize. She was not just beautiful and graceful, she was a DuPont. Her name represented a level of wealth and establishment prestige that even the Roosevelts, for all their political power, couldn't match. Marrying her would be more than a romantic union. It would be a merger of dynasties, a powerful symbol of American aristocracy. Their courtship was a whirlwind affair, chronicled breathlessly by the newspapers and magazines of the day. They were the it couple, America's sweethearts. Here was the handsome son of the liberal Democratic president wooing the lovely heiress of the conservative Republican DuPont clan. It was a story with everything glamour, power, wealth, and even a hint of political Romeo and Juliet. The press couldn't get enough of them. They were photographed at football games, at horse races, at glamorous parties. Their every move was documented. The public, weary from the daily grind of the Depression, devoured the details of this real-life fairy tale. The romance seemed to confirm that even in the darkest of times, glamour and grand romance could still exist. But even then, there were quiet signs of the fundamental differences that would later tear them apart. Franklin Jr. was loud, boisterous, and loved being the center of attention. He had a reputation for fast driving, late night parties, and a certain charming recklessness. Ethel, in contrast, was quiet and preferred small gatherings to massive crowds. She was sensitive to noise and chaos, the very elements in which her fiancé seemed to thrive. The most prescient concerns came from a woman who understood the pressures of public life better than anyone, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. While she was fond of Ethel, she harbored deep reservations about the match. She saw in Ethel a fragility and a gentle nature that she worried would be no match for her son's tempestuous personality and the relentless demands of being a Roosevelt. She wrote to a friend expressing her fear that Ethel was too gentle for the whirlwind life my children lead. She worried that Franklin Jr., with his boundless energy and sometimes thoughtless behavior, would simply overwhelm his delicate fiancée. It was a warning that would prove tragically accurate. Despite these private misgivings, the momentum of the romance was unstoppable. On November 14, 1936, the engagement was formally announced. The country went wild. The wedding was set for the following summer, and the press immediately began hyping it as the wedding of the century. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a national event, a spectacle that would bring together the two most powerful families in America. For Ethel Dupont, the quiet girl from Owl's Nest, the life she had known was about to be swept away forever, replaced by a storm of publicity and expectation from which she would never truly escape. June 30th, 1937. The day dawned hot and humid in northern Delaware, but the weather did little to dampen the electric atmosphere of anticipation. This was the day Ethel Dupont would marry Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. The event was not merely a wedding, it was a coronation, a public spectacle of a magnitude rarely seen in America. The press had dubbed it the wedding of the century, and for once the hyperbole felt entirely justified. The setting was Christ Church Christiana 100, a quaint, historic stone church near the Dupont family estate. But on this day, the peaceful church grounds were transformed into the epicenter of a media frenzy. More than 500 journalists, photographers, and newsreel cameramen descended on the scene, their cameras and microphones poised to capture every moment. State troopers were called in to manage the crowds as an estimated 20,000 onlookers, ordinary citizens eager for a glimpse of American royalty, lined the roads for miles, craning their necks for a view of the famous guest. The guest list itself was a roll call of American power. At the center, of course, were the two families. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, looking tired but proud, arrived to give his son away. His presence alone elevated the event to a matter of state. He was joined by the First Lady Eleanor, who watched with her characteristic blend of public poise and private concern. On the other side of the aisle sat the Dupont clan, a formidable phalanx of industrial titans, their expressions a mixture of family pride and perhaps a touch of patrician reserve at the circus-like atmosphere their daughter's wedding had become. Ethel's father, Eugene Dupont Jr., was a picture of nervous solemnity. He was a man who prized privacy above all else, and he was now at the center of the most public event imaginable. The ceremony was scheduled for 4:30 p.m., but the church was filled long before then with 1,200 invited guests. The heat inside was oppressive. There was no air conditioning, and guests fanned themselves with their programs, the air thick with the scent of wilting flowers and expensive perfume. The bride, shielded from the press until the last possible moment, arrived in a swirl of white satin. Ethel was a vision of bridal perfection. Her gown was traditional and elegant, with a high neckline, long sleeves, and a flowing train. On her head, She wore a delicate veil of rose point lace, an heirloom that had been in her family for generations. She carried a bouquet of white orchids and lilies of the valley. But behind the veil, those who knew her well could see the strain. Her face was pale, and her movements seemed tentative. She was the star of the show, but she looked less like a radiant bride and more like a beautiful, terrified doe caught in the headlights. In stark contrast, the groom was in his element. Franklin Jr. stood at the altar tall and beaming, his natural confidence and charisma on full display. He seemed to relish the attention, waving to friends and family, completely at ease with the magnitude of the moment. As Ethel walked down the aisle on her father's arm, the sheer force of their different personalities was palpable. He was the sun, brilliant and overpowering. She was the moon, quiet and reflective. The ceremony was brief, a traditional Episcopal service. They exchanged vows, the president's son and the industrialist's daughter, officially uniting the two great houses. As they were pronounced man and wife, a roar went up from the crowds outside who had been listening to the service on radios. The recessional was chaotic. The couple was mobbed by well-wishers and photographers as they tried to make their way out of the church. Ethel looked overwhelmed, clinging to her new husband's arm as he navigated them through the throng. The reception was held at Owl's Nest, the DuPont family home. The estate, usually a sanctuary of quiet gentility, was transformed into a bustling party for thousands of guests. Champagne flowed freely, and a massive marquee was set up on the lawn. The wedding gifts were staggering, a testament to the couple's status. They received hundreds of thousands of dollars in checks, stocks, and bonds, along with lavish presents from dignitaries and celebrities around the world. It was a treasure trove, befitting a royal couple. But amid the celebration, the cultural clash between the two families was on full display. The Roosevelts were boisterous and informal, their laughter echoing across the manicured lawns. The DuPont were more reserved, their conversations more muted. President Roosevelt, despite being confined to his wheelchair, was the life of the party, holding court and telling stories. The DuPonts, many of whom were his staunchest political opponents, regarded him with a mixture of respect for his office and deep-seated disagreement with his New Deal policies. It was a wedding, but it was also a temporary, fragile truce in a larger political and cultural war. For Ethel, the day was an ordeal. She performed her duties with grace, smiling for photos, cutting the cake, and greeting an endless line of guests. But friends and family noted her exhaustion. The sheer scale of the event, the constant noise, the thousands of eyes on her, it was everything her shy nature recoiled from. This grand public spectacle was her initiation into the Roosevelt world, a world where her private life would now and forever be public property. As the couple finally departed for their honeymoon, driving away in a shower of rice and good wishes, the fairy tale seemed complete. But the foundation of their marriage had been laid not in quiet intimacy, but in the glaring, unforgiving spotlight of public expectation. The seeds of its eventual collapse were already sown. After the whirlwind of the wedding, Ethel and Franklin Jr. settled into what was supposed to be the beginning of their new life. They moved to a rambling house in Charlottesville, Virginia, so Franklin could complete his law degree at the University of Virginia. For a brief period, it seemed as though Ethel might find the quiet life she craved. Charlottesville was a world away from the political hothouse of Washington, D.C., and the insular society of Delaware. Here, she could focus on being a wife and soon a mother. Their first son, Franklin Delano Roosevelt III, was born in 1938. The birth of a child brought joy and a new sense of purpose to Ethel. She adored her son and embraced motherhood with a quiet devotion. A second son, Christopher DuPont Roosevelt, followed in 1941. Ethel created a warm and loving home for her boys, a sanctuary of stability in a life that was often anything but. She managed the household, oversaw the staff, and tried to build a life that resembled the ordered, predictable world she had known growing up. But the whirlwind was never far away. Franklin Jr. was a Roosevelt, and the name carried with it an inescapable pull towards public life and a restless energy that chafed against the confines of domestic tranquility. Even in Virginia, their life was not entirely private. They were still the president's son and his wealthy wife, and they were expected to entertain, to attend functions, and to play their part in the broader Roosevelt drama. The Roosevelt family was a force of nature. Visits from his boisterous siblings and his formidable mother Eleanor would descend upon their home, filling it with noise, political debate, and an energy that Ethel often found draining. The fundamental differences in their personalities, which had been visible during their courtship, became more pronounced in the daily reality of marriage. Franklin Jr. was an extrovert who thrived on social interaction. He loved parties, political arguments, and the company of a large circle of friends. He was charming and gregarious, but also had a notoriously short temper and a restless spirit. Ethel was his opposite. She was an introvert who needed quiet and solitude to recharge. She preferred intimate dinners with a few close friends to the raucous gatherings her husband favored. While he was energized by chaos, she was depleted by it. His heavy drinking also became a significant issue. Like his famous father and many men of his class and generation, Franklin Jr. drank to excess. His drinking often exacerbated his worst qualities, making him louder, more argumentative, and more reckless. For Ethel, who had grown up in the more staid and controlled DuPont environment, his behavior was often unsettling and embarrassing. The entry of the United States into World War II in December 1941 marked a major turning point in their marriage and their lives. Like his brothers, Franklin Jr. was eager to serve. He joined the U.S. Navy and was commissioned as an officer. He served with distinction, primarily on destroyers in the Atlantic and Mediterranean theaters. He was a brave and capable officer, seeing intense combat and earning decorations for his valor, including the Silver Star. His wartime service was a source of great pride for the Roosevelt family and was widely publicized back home. He was another Roosevelt son, risking his life for his country, but his long absences placed an immense strain on Ethel. For months and sometimes years at a time, she was left alone to raise their two young sons. She managed the household, dealt with rationing and wartime shortages, and lived with the constant gnawing fear that her husband might not come home. While she was proud of his service, she was also profoundly lonely. She was isolated from her own family in Delaware and felt like an outsider within the Roosevelt clan. She was living the life of a Roosevelt wife in name, but without the partnership and support of her husband. The war also widened the gulf between them. Franklin Jr. was living a life of high-stakes drama and adrenaline, surrounded by other men in the crucible of combat. Ethel was living a quiet domestic life defined by the rhythms of childcare and the anxieties of the home front. When he did return on leave, they found they had less and less in common. He was full of war stories and a restless energy that couldn't be contained by the quiet life she had built. He sought out the camaraderie of his friends and the excitement of parties, while she craved the simple comfort of having her husband home. It was during these years that the rumors of Franklin Jr.'s infidelity began to surface. He was a handsome, famous man, and the temptations were many. Away from home for long periods, he engaged in numerous affairs. While these were likely kept from Ethel for a time, the whispers eventually reached her. For a woman as sensitive and private as Ethel, the betrayal was devastating. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the public nature of it, the humiliation of being the wife of a man whose dalliances were becoming common gossip. By the end of the war in 1945, Franklin Jr. returned home a war hero, but the marriage he returned to was broken in all but name. The charming law student Ethel had married was now a man hardened by war, emboldened by his heroics, and determined to launch a political career of his own. The quiet life Ethel had hoped for was now further away than ever. He had his sights set on Congress, a path that would demand even more public appearances, more social obligations, and more of the chaotic, spotlight-driven life that she had come to dread. The fairy tale had unraveled, replaced by a harsh reality of emotional distance, betrayal, and fundamentally incompatible desires. Ethel was trapped in a life she had never wanted, married to a man she no longer seemed to know. The strain was beginning to take a terrible toll, not just on her marriage, but on her fragile mental and emotional health. The true tragedy of Ethel DuPont's life was not just the dissolution of her marriage, but the slow, painful erosion of her own identity and well-being within it. The union that was meant to be a merger of dynasties became for her a collision of worlds from which she could never recover. Her personal story is a poignant testament to the immense emotional impact of living a life that is fundamentally at odds with one's own nature. At its core, the marriage was a clash of cultures. The DuPonts and the Roosevelts, despite both being part of the American aristocracy, operated on entirely different principles. The DuPont world was one of immense wealth, but it was also a world of order, privacy, and emotional restraint. Business was the family's public face. Private life was meant to be exactly that, private. Emotions were not to be displayed ostentatiously. Problems were handled discreetly, behind the closed doors of their sprawling estates. Ethel was raised in this environment of quiet decorum. The Roosevelt world was the antithesis of this. It was a world of public performance, chaotic energy, and relentless political maneuvering. The home of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, whether at Hyde Park, Campobello, or the White House, was a perpetually buzzing hub of activity. It was filled with political aides, journalists, visiting dignitaries, and a constant stream of family and friends. Debate was loud, emotions were expressed freely, and privacy was a scarce commodity. As Eleanor Roosevelt herself once wrote, "We were all of us, Roosevelts and friends, a noisy, talkative, and, on the whole, happy and exciting group." For Ethel, being thrust into this environment was like being a delicate hothouse flower planted in the middle of a hurricane. She was not equipped for the noise, the lack of privacy, or the constant need to be on. She was shy and introverted, and the Rooseveltian demand for constant social engagement was utterly exhausting for her. Family gatherings were not quiet affairs, they were boisterous, often argumentative events where everyone was expected to hold their own. Ethel, who was not naturally assertive or confrontational, often faded into the background, a quiet and beautiful ghost at the edge of the whirlwind. Her new husband was the ringmaster of this circus. Franklin Jr. was the quintessential Roosevelt, charming, loud, and utterly at home in the spotlight. He adored the political game and the social whirl that came with it. He couldn't understand his wife's need for solitude and quiet, her desire to retreat from the very world that energized him was a source of constant friction. He saw her sensitivity not as an innate part of her character, but as a weakness, a failure to adapt to the life he had chosen for them. The emotional toll on Ethel was immense. She felt isolated and misunderstood. Her in-laws, while not unkind, were a formidable and often intimidating group. Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman of immense strength and public purpose, struggled to connect with her daughter-in-law's quiet fragility. While she felt sympathy for Ethel, she also couldn't fully comprehend a woman who seemed so overwhelmed by the life she herself navigated with such apparent ease. Ethel was an outsider in her own family, a DuPont in the court of the Roosevelts, and the chasm was too wide to bridge. This feeling of isolation was compounded by Franklin Jr.'s increasingly reckless behavior. His drinking, his affairs, and his temper created an atmosphere of instability and emotional turmoil. Ethel was a woman who craved security and predictability, and her husband provided neither. The home she tried so hard to create as a sanctuary was constantly being disrupted by his unpredictable moods and his entourage of political and social acquaintances. It was during the difficult post-war years that Ethel's mental health began to seriously decline. The years of loneliness, the stress of her husband's infidelities, and the constant pressure of living a life so contrary to her nature pushed her to a breaking point. She began to suffer from severe depression and anxiety. In the language of the time, she was said to be suffering from nervous exhaustion. Today, we would recognize her symptoms as those of a person in deep psychological distress, likely suffering from clinical depression brought on by prolonged emotional trauma and a profound sense of hopelessness. She experienced what were then called nervous breakdowns, episodes of such intense emotional and psychological pain that she required professional help. She was hospitalized on several occasions, seeking treatment at institutions like the Austin Riggs Center in Massachusetts, a well-known psychiatric hospital that catered to the wealthy. This was a source of deep shame and secrecy for the family. In the 1940s, mental illness carried a heavy stigma, especially for women of high society. It was seen as a personal failing, a sign of weakness, or a lack of moral character. For a family as private as the DuPonts, having a daughter who required psychiatric care was a closely guarded secret, a source of quiet family anguish. For Ethel, these hospitalizations were a desperate search for relief, but they also deepened her sense of failure. She had failed to be the wife her husband wanted, failed to be the strong, unflappable Roosevelt woman her in-laws expected. And now, she was failing to even maintain her own mental stability. The emotional pain was intertwined with a profound sense of shame. One of the most poignant and revealing anecdotes from this period comes from those who knew the couple well. Friends recalled that when Franklin Jr. would begin one of his loud, angry tirades, often fueled by alcohol, Ethel would not argue back. Instead, she would simply shrink. She would physically seem to get smaller, retreating into herself, her face pale and her eyes filled with a look of quiet terror. It was the look of a person who had learned that fighting back was futile and that the only defense was to disappear. Her husband seemed incapable of understanding the depth of her pain. His response to her struggles was often impatience and frustration. He saw her depression as an inconvenience, an obstacle to his political ambitions. He wanted a wife who could stand by his side on the campaign trail, host glamorous parties, and charm political donors. Instead, he had a wife who was often too fragile to even leave the house. His lack of empathy only served to deepen her despair. She was not only suffering, but she was suffering alone, with a partner who was a source of her pain rather than a source of comfort. The fairy tale had become a nightmare, and for Ethel, there seemed to be no way to wake up. By the late 1940s, the marriage of Ethel DuPont and Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. was a hollow shell. The love and excitement of their early courtship had long since evaporated, replaced by years of bitterness, betrayal, and profound incompatibility. The end, when it came, was not quiet or dignified. It was a messy public affair that once again thrust the intensely private Ethel into the glaring spotlight she so desperately wished to avoid. The final break came in 1949. Franklin Jr., having successfully run for Congress in a special election, was now a U.S. representative from New York. His political career was on the rise, and he was spending more and more time in Washington, D.C., fully immersed in the world of power and politics he had always craved. His life was a whirlwind of legislative sessions, constituent meetings, and late-night socializing on the D.C. circuit. Ethel and the children remained at their home in Katona, New York. The physical and emotional distance between them had become a chasm. The official separation was announced, and soon after, Ethel filed for divorce. The proceedings took place in Ketchum, Idaho, one of the few places at the time that allowed for a relatively quick divorce. But there was nothing quick or easy about the public fallout. The divorce of a Roosevelt, especially a son of the beloved late president, was major news. The grounds cited for the divorce were grievous mental cruelty. In the legal parlance of the day, this was a serious and deeply personal accusation. In her court testimony, Ethel provided a heartbreaking glimpse into the reality of her marriage. She spoke of her husband's ungovernable temper and constant criticism. She testified that he had a violent and nasty temper, which made her fearful for her own safety and the safety of her children. She described a life of constant emotional turmoil, where she was subjected to verbal abuse that left her a nervous wreck. This testimony, reported in newspapers across the country, was a stunning public rebuke of the Roosevelt mystique. It shattered the carefully cultivated image of the charming, heroic war veteran and congressman. For the first time, the public was given a look behind the curtain of this fairy tale marriage, and the picture it revealed was ugly and painful. For Ethel, having to air these private humiliations in a public courtroom must have been an agonizing ordeal, a violation of every instinct she had. But it was the price she had to pay for her freedom. The divorce was granted on May 21, 1949. It was a landmark event, marking the first ever divorce for a child of a U.S. president. The settlement was substantial. Ethel received custody of their 2 sons and a significant financial arrangement, including a trust fund of over $1 million, an enormous sum at the time for the children. But no amount of money could erase the scars of the 12-year marriage. The controversy surrounding the divorce was intense. Public opinion was divided. Many, loyal to the Roosevelt name and legacy, saw Franklin Jr. as the wronged party, saddled with a wife who was too emotionally fragile and ill-suited for the demands of public life. In this interpretation, Ethel was the weak link, a woman whose nervous problems had made the marriage untenable. This narrative was quietly encouraged by some in the Roosevelt camp who sought to protect Franklin Jr.'s burgeoning political career from the scandal. They painted a picture of a man who had done his best to cope with a difficult and unstable wife. However, others saw the story differently. They saw Ethel as the victim, a gentle and sensitive woman who had been emotionally battered and broken by a callous, self-absorbed, and unfaithful husband. Her testimony of cruelty and fear resonated with many, particularly women, who understood the quiet suffering that could exist behind the closed doors of even the most prominent homes. In this view, Franklin Jr. was a bully who had used his power and charisma to dominate and ultimately destroy his wife's spirit. The DuPont family, ever private, remained publicly silent, but their support for Ethel was unwavering. They closed ranks around their daughter, providing her with the financial and emotional security she needed to escape the marriage. This historical debate continues to this day among biographers and historians. Was Ethel a casualty of the Roosevelt machine, a woman too delicate for the world she married into? Or was Franklin Jr. a deeply flawed man whose behavior would have destroyed any marriage? The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in between. They were two profoundly different people, products of two profoundly different worlds, locked in a union that was doomed from the start. Beyond the he said, she said of the divorce, Ethel's story highlights a deeper historical issue: the stigma and misunderstanding of mental illness in the mid-20th century. Her struggles with depression were not seen as a legitimate medical condition resulting from her circumstances, but as a character flaw. The term nervous breakdown was a vague, dismissive label often applied to women who were struggling to cope with unhappy marriages or oppressive social expectations. There was little public sympathy or understanding for what she was going through. Her pain was weaponized in the court of public opinion, used to paint her as an unstable and unreliable narrator of her own life. In the end, the divorce was a public spectacle that laid bare the private misery of their lives. Franklin Jr. remarried just a few months later to a woman named Suzanne Perrin, further cementing the public impression that he had long since moved on. For Ethel, the divorce was not a new beginning, but the end of a long and painful chapter. She had finally escaped the whirlwind, but she was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been shattered by the storm. In the aftermath of her tumultuous divorce, Ethel DuPont sought one thing above all else: anonymity. She had spent 12 years as Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr., a public figure whose every move was scrutinized. Now, free from that gilded cage, she retreated from the world, desperately trying to reclaim the privacy she had lost. The consequences of her marriage had left deep and lasting scars, and the rest of her life would be a quiet and ultimately tragic struggle to heal them. She legally reclaimed her maiden name, becoming Ethel DuPont once more. It was a symbolic act of shedding the identity that had caused her so much pain. She settled into a quiet life, focusing on her two sons, Franklin III and Christopher. She was a devoted mother, and in her children she found a sense of purpose and unconditional love that had been absent from her marriage. She created a stable, peaceful home for them, the very kind of sanctuary she had always longed for herself. In 1951, 2 years after her divorce, Ethel found a second chance at happiness. She married Benjamin S. Warren Sr., a prominent local lawyer from her native Delaware. Her choice of husband was telling. Warren was the complete opposite of Franklin Roosevelt Jr. He was not a public figure, not a politician, and not a man who sought the spotlight. He was a quiet, stable, and respected member of the community. Their wedding was a small private affair, attended only by close family and friends, a world away from the media circus of her first wedding. With Benjamin Warren, Ethel seemed to find a measure of the peace that had so long eluded her. They lived a life of quiet domesticity, far from the political intrigues of Washington or the social whirl of New York. She dedicated herself to her family, her home, and her passion for gardening and raising horses. To the outside world, it appeared that the broken heiress had finally found a safe harbor. But the trauma of her years with Roosevelt had inflicted a wound that never fully healed. Despite her new, more peaceful life, Ethel continued to be plagued by bouts of severe depression. The nervous exhaustion that had haunted her during her first marriage did not simply disappear. It was a chronic condition, a shadow that followed her even into the light of her seemingly happy new life. She continued to require medical care for her mental health, a private struggle she endured with the support of her new husband and her family. The story of Ethel Dupont reached its devastating conclusion on Christmas Day 1965. At her home in Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan, where she and Benjamin Warren were living, Ethel, at the age of just 49, took her own life. Her death was a shock to those who thought she had finally found contentment. It was the tragic culmination of a lifetime of pain, a final surrender to the depression that had shadowed her for decades. Her death was reported in the newspapers, a brief and somber final chapter in the life of the woman who had once been the star of the wedding of the century. The obituaries noted her famous first marriage and her Dupont heritage, but they could not capture the depth of the private suffering that led to her final, desperate act. The historical significance of Ethel Dupont's story is profound, though often overlooked. It serves as a powerful and cautionary tale about the illusion of the fairy tale. Her life demonstrates that immense wealth and social status are no shield against profound human suffering. She had everything that society deemed valuable: beauty, money, a famous name, yet she was desperately unhappy. Her story forces us to look beyond the glittering surface of public lives and consider the hidden emotional costs of fame, pressure, and living in the shadow of a powerful dynasty. Furthermore, Ethel's life is a crucial lens through which to view the history of women's mental health. She was a victim not only of a difficult marriage, but also of an era that had little understanding of or compassion for psychological distress. Her pain was dismissed as nervousness or feminine weakness. She was told to be stronger, to adapt, to simply cope with a situation that was, for her, fundamentally unbearable. Her story highlights the lonely struggle of countless women of her generation whose emotional suffering was ignored, pathologized, or treated as a source of shame rather than a legitimate illness. Her legacy is not one of political achievements or public accolades. It is a more quiet and somber one. She is a reminder of the forgotten women of history, the ones whose stories are often relegated to footnotes in the biographies of powerful men. By remembering Ethel, we acknowledge the reality that behind the grand sweep of history are individual human lives, filled with their own private joys and, in her case, immense and tragic sorrows. She matters because her story is a testament to the fragility of the human spirit and a powerful reminder that the most important battles are often the ones fought not on the world's stage but in the silent, lonely chambers of the heart. Her life, though cut short, speaks volumes about the true meaning of happiness and the devastating price of a dream that turns into a nightmare. In the end, the story of Ethel Dupont is not a fairy tale with a tragic ending. It is a profound human drama that was never a fairy tale to begin with. It was the story of a shy, gentle woman born into a world of unimaginable wealth and privilege, who was thrust onto a public stage she never sought and into a life she was not built to endure. Her marriage to Franklin Roosevelt Jr., celebrated as the union of American royalty, was in reality a deeply personal tragedy played out in the full glare of the public eye. She was a woman defined by the men in her life, first as the daughter of a Dupont, then as the wife of a Roosevelt. Yet her true story lies in the space between those powerful names, in her silent struggle against expectations that suffocated her spirit. Her life was a heartbreaking illustration that a gilded cage is still a cage, and that the trappings of a perfect life can become the architecture of a private prison. We remember Ethel Dupont, not for the glamour of her wedding or the scandal of her divorce, but for the quiet dignity with which she faced her immense struggles. Her life is a somber but essential reminder of the invisible wounds that people carry, of the devastating impact of emotional cruelty, and of the societal failures in understanding mental health. She was the heiress the president's son couldn't save. Perhaps because the forces she was fighting against, a relentless public, a difficult husband, and the crushing weight of her own sensitive nature, were a storm that no one could have weathered unscathed. Her story lingers as a poignant echo from the past, a quiet plea to look beyond the headlines and remember the fragile human heart that beats within.